Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I am the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at CUNY's Graduate School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this evening. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of event recordings, dozens of podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a more interpersonal experience should also check out our online adult education program, Gotham Ed, offering mini courses taught by leading experts. Sign up now at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the best and most interesting research on New York City history, we'll be discussing this wonderfully rich new group biography from Daniel Schulman about the mid-19th century immigrants who came to dominate the world of German Jewish finance and philanthropy during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Some of those names are familiar to us now, especially Goldman and Sachs, who founded a rather inconsequential bank, which now, of course, is the world's largest investment firm, and the only major Jewish house to survive the mergers, acquisitions, and bankruptcies that followed the period in question here. Other figures in this study are strangely more forgotten, like the main character in the group portrait, Jacob Schiff. Schiff was a dominant figure in Jewish New York at the turn of the century. From 1885 onwards, he led Loebs, a famous Jewish bank later absorbed into another, which has likewise since disappeared, Lehman Brothers. Although most banks were, of course, not Jewish, for many years, Loebs was the greatest rival to J.P. Morgan's bank, the strongest of all the houses which dominated Wall Street, and thus not just the American, but the global financial system by the end of World War I. In part for this reason, our guest tonight explains, he was drawn to researching this group because he did not feel as though they had gotten their due. Half a century ago, the same group was depicted in a best-selling portrait by Stephen Birmingham, which presented them as the Jewish 100, referencing the famous 400 families which dominated the city and nation by the end of the Gilded Age. Some reviewers have contrasted Birmingham's work, A Social History that could sometimes veer into tabloid and gossip, with this new monograph, which bills itself as a book about the origins of modern finance. But as Schulman makes clear throughout, the families in this story were never just bankers. They helped finance some of the biggest names in the history of global capitalism: General Motors, Kodak, Macy's, B.F. Goodrich, Paramount, Polaroid, Sears, Studebaker, Western Union, Westinghouse, Woolworth, etc. But they were also Jews in a profoundly anti-Jewish time, and they helped, quote, ensure a future for Jewry in America by creating a self-sustaining network of mutual aid groups like other immigrant groups in America, hospitals, orphanages, schools, work centers, which gave them influence over millions of Eastern European Jews who arrived at the fin de siècle. And from that position, they also made a huge imprint on the arts, literature, film, music, libraries, museums, universities, and used that large financial clout to advocate for Jewish rights on the international stage. In some, they became, as our guest argues, the first major Jewish American lobby. I'll stop here, but allow me to just briefly introduce our guest and moderator this evening. Dan Schulman is the deputy editor of Mother Jones magazine and is a longtime journalist whose work has been appeared in publications including Boston Globe, Politico, Vanity Fair, The Washington Post. He is also a best-selling author whose first book, Sons of Wichita, was a biography of the Koch brothers and a finalist for the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award. The Money Kings is his second book and has similarly won enormous praise. Beverly Gage, the Pulitzer-winning biographer of J. Edgar Hoover, describes him as our foremost historian of the American business dynasty. To lead us in conversation tonight, we've invited an old friend of the Gotham Center, David Huyson, an expert in the history of American political economy, and particularly that of New York City, whose research has extended to many aspects of global capitalism from the 19th century to the present. A former senior lecturer at the University of York in England, now teaching at the New School, David has taught previously at Yale, Wesleyan, and New York University, and his commentary has appeared in BBC News, Deutsche Welle Radio, and Le Monde. His first book, Progressive Inequality, Rich and Poor in New York, 1890 to 1920, appeared with Harvard University Press and challenged the popular notion that progressive era reforms made a dramatic difference in the inequities of the Gilded Age. He is currently finishing a biographical history of Alfred Winslow Jones, the socialist inventor of the modern hedge fund, which has been supported by the Tobin Project, the Miss Giles Whiting Foundation, and the New York Historical. I'm extremely pleased to welcome both of our guests here. One last bit of housekeeping before the conversation begins. As usual, the chat and hand-raising functions in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our speakers. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And I encourage you to do so at any point during the next hour of conversation. We'll begin answering those questions around 7:30 or so. With that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming our guests with the usual bit of silent applause.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Peter. I'm delighted and honored to be here. And I have to say, really quite in awe of Dan's accomplishments of sensitive portraiture and storytelling in this book. I suspect I have far more questions than it will be possible to fit into the time that we have. And I know that we want to save time for audience questions at the end. So I want to get right into it, but I would be remiss if I failed to begin by emphasizing just what an incredible and impressive feat it is to produce literary nonfiction of this scope and artistry. The Money Kings carries readers across nearly a century of history within geographies of finance and foreign relations, stretching all the way around the world, while at the same time maintaining a human intimacy and a sense of proximity to living, breathing subjects that compels a reader to keep turning the pages. And I turned every one. It is really an extraordinary achievement. So first and foremost, I want to say congratulations, Dan. And is the paperback coming out soon?
The paperback's out, and thank you so much.
Oh, terrific!
Yeah, it's
the
been
publisher sent me the hard copy, so I got the lasting version. Well, I thought we'd begin by creating space for you to talk a little bit about, just to give the audience a general sense of what the book's about, how you came to it. And I thought maybe a good way of doing that would be to ask about its relationship to if any, to your first book, The Sons of Wichita, which I did not have an opportunity to read, but is about the Koch family and its empire. You know, presumably this is why my old mentor, Bev Gage, says you're now the foremost historian of American dynasties.
That's a good question. Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting. I sort of accidentally ended up writing about business and finance, which were not, you know, previously my primary interests. I mean, what interests me is power and influence and dynasty and the way that people shape the world, and that tends to happen with folks that have a great amount of wealth. So, you know, after I'd finished the Sons of Wichita book, I was looking for another big dynastic story, and you know, my usual process is just to sort of come up with a thousand different ideas and follow rabbit holes where they lead. And in this case, I just ended up researching this wave of anarchist violence that Beverly Gage wrote about at the turn of the century that culminated with the bombing of Wall Street. And in this process, I came across an article that mentioned the recipient of one of these anarchist letter bombs. They were sending them to J.P. Morgan and the major sort of Gilded Age financiers of that era. And that was Jacob Schiff. And that name sort of rang a bit of a bell, but you know, I did not know much about Jacob Schiff. And as I sort of studied his life a little bit, my eyes widened, and I was just amazed at both what he had accomplished and how little was known. There had not been a major biography of him at that time. So what this project sort of started as, I was planning to do a biography of Jacob Schiff, and I realized, though, to tell Schiff's story, you sort of have to bring in his contemporaries, the members of his business and philanthropic circle, and that is the members of the Goldman Sachs, Lehman, Seligman, and Warburg families. So that's sort of how I arrived at this idea. And, you know, this was a topic that really resonated with me the more I researched, because I realized that my own family has a deep connection to this story. My father's parents were immigrants from what is present day Ukraine, what was then, my grandfather was from the Russian Empire. My grandmother was, it depended on the day what she would say. We did Poland, Austria. She didn't,
Right.
she didn't know. But they settled in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and they were part of these waves of immigration that Jacob Schiff and his allies helped to enable through both their philanthropy and through their political advocacy. So that's how I ended up getting there.
Right, and it's a really extraordinary group of people, and not least because of their relevance to the histories that I think most of our audience is particularly interested. I mean, of course, our audiences are very well read and widely erudite, but we do attract a disproportionate amount of interest in the history of New York City. So, for scholars of New York City, what would you say are the sort of central reasons that scholars of New York City should really care about these figures and care about their memory?
I think they help to build modern New York. You can't, once you learn about who these people are and what they did, you can't take a walk through New York City today without sort of encountering their fingerprints, whether it,
Hmm.
on an institution like Barnard that Schiff helped found, whether it's on places like the Henry Street Settlement, which is still in existence, he also helped to found. Whether it's the Robert Lehman wing at the Metropolitan or the New York Public Library, or just the architecture of the Upper East Side.
Hmm.
It's amazing how much of that still exists. And there's also the fact that they helped to make New York a financial superpower, a financial power,
Hmm.
the financial capital of the United States, um, and later of the world. So all of that they played a part in.
Well, I think a lot of my subsequent questions, I think will delve into different areas that you basically moved through there. So that was a wonderful overview. Um, I did want to ask one more question, though, at least one more question about kind of process and the writing of the book. As someone who is also trying to complete a biographically driven history, biographers notoriously often have kind of ambivalent relationships to their subjects, and I'm wondering if that happened for you through the research or the writing. Any particular moments that stick out for you that really unsettled you slightly or changed your opinion of the people that you were writing about, that you might want to share?
I think approaching this topic from the get-go made me a little bit uneasy. Just because this was a book about Jewish money, Jewish power, and inevitably, those stereotypes would come up. And what was I going to find when I poked into their financial dealings?
Right. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but I mean, anti-Semitism and historical memory are at the core of the book's project.
Absolutely. These were sort of the Jewish bankers that are part of all of these conspiracy theories, and there was a reason for that. They became targets. But so, and this goes back to this something that I read about in the introduction to the book was, why did I call it the Money Kings?
Hmm.
And this was a phrase that was used at the turn of the century by the papers and the pundits to describe the major financiers of that era. So J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, they were money kings, but so was Jacob Schiff. But of course, that's a sort of can be a little bit of a loaded term. But the more I sort of thought about this, if you look up Jacob Schiff online, you're going to immediately hit websites that are spinning the craziest conspiracy theories. It seemed like the anti-Semites and conspiracy mongers were the only ones who cared about keeping his legacy alive, but for all of the
Hmm.
wrong reasons. But I wouldn't hesitate to write a book about Morgan or Rockefeller and call it Money Kings. But
Right.
why should I hesitate to write about, Schiff or Marcus Goldman and call it the same? So that's why sort of I ended up with that title.
Right. I was going to ask about that. So I'm glad clarified it voluntarily. Uh, but let me ask for the historical scholars in the audience, the practitioners, what were the kinds of sources that you were using for this? I mean, you mentioned obviously it's part of the motivation for writing the book that you felt like these figures hadn't gotten their historical due. Did that present I mean, I feel like I know it didn't present an enormous problem in terms of your bibliography because your research is quite extensive and you did find sources, but I'm just curious what were kind of the most interesting or provocative sources that you used, some of the most difficult ones maybe that you had to read between the lines on.
That's a really good question. I just cast an extremely wide net. I did everything from, interview descendants, the Schiff family, I was in touch with from the get-go, and they were extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing, as you know, when you're sort of doing that type of research, you're trying to find where the documents are. It's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
collections of the family members, which often turn out to be wrong, but what type of letters do they have? What type of papers? And so in a few instances, I was able to find, including a trove of Schiff letters that were, they were not only in German, they were in a written form of German that modern day Germans can't even read. So I had,
Shorthand. Yeah.
the shorthand, so I had to find someone to translate those letters, which was a task in itself. But in terms of the archival sources, I spent some time in Berlin and Hamburg. I went to the German State Department and found really fascinating records tracing back to World War I that really had to do with German efforts to influence the German Jewish bankers of Wall Street. Um,
Right.
I went to, one extremely fascinating source of information was the R.G. Dunn and Company credit report volumes, which are at the Harvard Baker Library, not far from where I live. And, that enabled me to sort of like trace the early impressions of these firms. And what was so fascinating about these ledgers is that the entries weren't dry. The credit reporters were canvassing the country, rating the credit of all sorts of businesses, including Goldman Sachs and Lehman and Lehman. And they were making observations about the businessmen. And
Mm-hmm.
Joe has a drinking problem. You shouldn't, that sort of stuff. So I
Character
yeah,
references.
exactly. And in terms of the Lehmans who settled first in the South, this ended up being really very revealing because when they arrive in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the first notations has to do with their Jewishness. It basically
Mm-hmm.
says you shouldn't trust them because they're Jews. They can't be trusted to if you consign goods to them.
Right.
But 10 years later, they'd clearly risen in the hierarchy there, and the notation on the eve of the Civil War was, they're upstanding businessmen, good for all their debts, almost as good as white men. And what that says, that just gives you a sense of how they were perceived in
Mm-hmm.
that in Alabama in that era, and it sort of, to me, it sort of helps to explain their their strenuous effort to assimilate in Southern culture.
Yeah, and not just how they were perceived in Alabama, but how they were perceived nationally, right? Like,
Exactly.
R.G. Dunn and Co. or Dunn and Bradstreet, its predecessor, were national reviewers of business credibility. So this was, in some ways speaks to the links between the North and the South industrially and in terms of a national business community in that antebellum period to to contrary to long held beliefs that these were sort of two separate economies or areas of economic interest in the United States. Um,
Absolutely. And I think this goes to your question earlier too. It's just about, what I might find when I looked at these families, because, especially when you look at the Lehmans, they owned slaves. Um,
mhm.
they were, black marketeers. There's parts of their background that you cock an eyebrow at. But I thought the important thing to me was just to tell the unvarnished story, because again, one of the through lines of this is, how these myths about Jewish money and power came to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good transition to talking about anti-Semitism and historical memory, which, as I said, are at the core of this book's concerns. So I've heard you speak before a bit about how part of your attraction to the project was your amazement, and you, in fact, just said this earlier, your amazement at the fact that there was no up-to-date um, modern biography of Jacob Schiff, discounting the sort of Cyrus Adler 2-volume, 1,000-page appreciation letter, basically, of 1928. Do you think that anti-Semitism or concerns about fueling anti-Semitism, similar maybe to the ones that you sort of had the strength or had to marshal the strength to shrug off in writing the book, maybe particularly among post-Holocaust, mid-century scholars, may have played a role in that relative dearth of historiographical attention?
It's, David, I think it's possible that people were concerned about touching the subject. Jacob Schiff ended up is a side, or a side character in a number of wonderful wonderful books. I also think it's the fact that
a number of books by me.
Oh, of course. And and I think that he was sort of, it's not just him, it was all of who I call the money kings. They couldn't just be bankers. Jacob Schiff couldn't be America's top investment banker, which he, next to JP Morgan, he
Right.
was. He was always described as a Jewish banker. And I think that was part of it. I think he also did not seem to care very much if his name lived on. He was a sort of living in the moment type of guy.
Mm-hmm.
With his philanthropy, when he died, the New York Times tried to just assemble a picture of all of his giving, and it just couldn't, because so many of his gifts had been anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
He was a partner in the firm of Loeb, which he married into. He very easily could have slapped his name on that. But he didn't. So I think there's a number of different factors there.
Right. So getting more into, I think, the question of anti-Semitism by way of some of those other figures alongside Schiff in the book. There's this classic old Borscht Belt joke about a Jew stranded on a deserted island whose rescuers find that he's built 3 houses. I think you may know this one. He's the first house he lives in. The second 2 houses are synagogues. And they ask him, why did you build 2 synagogues? And he says, the first one is the one I attend. The other one is the one I wouldn't be caught dead in. And I feel like, I always feel like this joke is actually a great way of deflating one of the central canards of anti-Semitism, that Jews, in all their insularity, are all in on the same nefarious plot. If that canard were to hold, one would expect that a deeply intermarried group of Jewish banking families in a single city would all be on the same page about domestic and world politics. But as you show very sensitively, I think they were much more like the proverbial castaways, even among themselves. So can you tell us some of the major issues that divided the Schiffs and Seligmans from the Warburgs and the Loebs, the Goldmans from the Sachses and the Lehmans?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that really divided the Jewish community at the turn of the century was this issue of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
They were, the German Jews predominantly came to the United States in the mid 1800s, and the major waves of Russian and Eastern European immigration really begin in the 1880s after the assassination of the Russian Tsar, which was blamed on a Jew. And
Mm-hmm.
what was fascinating to me is that, when the Russians start to arrive in the United States, the Jewish community holds a meeting. They were always holding these big mass meetings to figure out what to do, and
Mm-hmm.
they suggested creating a permanent aid organization. And at that time, Schiff who would the immigrant would find no greater friend than Jacob Schiff. But at that time, he said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Has anyone heard of any ethnic group creating an aid organization just to help immigrants of their own community?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there was a lot of ambivalence, and but at the same time, the German Jews recognized they would be painted with the same brush as their Eastern European and Russian brethren, with whom they really didn't have a heck of a lot in common, other than their religion. But they realized that their place in the social hierarchy was so shaky that
Mm-hmm.
they needed to work to uplift the immigrant and Americanize the immigrants. Another sort of related issue that really divided the Jewish community of that era was Zionism, which was sort of course, at that it was a wild-eyed idea, and people like Schiff and many German Jews, many mainstream American Jews were opposed to the idea of Zionism because they believed that it underscored this idea of dual loyalties that had been so
Mm-hmm.
dangerous. Um, and then, of course, an issue that really split the Jewish community and the German Jewish community was World War One, and you know this this caused an existential crisis within Goldman Sachs, where Henry Goldman, who was the son of the founder, and his brother-in-law Sam Sachs had just completely divergent views on the war. Henry was staunchly pro-German, and Sam was pro-ally, and it got to the point where Henry resigned from Goldman Sachs amidst the war, and there was never another Goldman that worked for that firm.
And
Um,
this was fundamentally about nationalist affinities, right? Like this was a kind of sense of national identification with Germany versus the United States.
yes, and he was, Henry was a little bit of an outlier because he had been born in the United States, and it was common for many of the scions of these German Jewish firms, like Jacob Schiff's son Mortimer,
Mm-hmm.
they were trying to assimilate. They were extremely pro-ally. Whereas the older generation, including Schiff, still identified to some degree with Germany, at least at the
Mm-hmm.
outset.
Oh, and they were still speaking German,
They
and
were still
for
speaking.
instance,
Absolutely.
you have this lovely coda at the end of the book about your visit to Salem Fields and the cemetery where the Schiff and Loeb and Warburg family are buried, entombed, really, and the sort of dedication inside the tomb is in German, right? It
German.
is
Yeah.
was
Thank
du
you.
was du ewig liebst, ist ewig deins, or dein.
Love
What you
for.
love forever is forever yours.
Yep.
Um, so that sense of connection to another national identity, or at least another culture, not necessarily another national identity, because I think I mean you say this in the book as well. For Schiff particularly, he was an American first. Like he had these three layers to his identity, and this is the way that he described himself. He was an American first, and actually bristled in some correspondence with people who sometimes reach out to him ostensibly explicitly on behalf of the Jewish community and only the Jewish community, right? Or they reached out to him as a Jew rather than
Right.
as a purveyor of non-sectarian philanthropy.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that was, but World War One really disrupted. I mean, and he writes about Schiff. You talked about this. He used to talk about the trinity of his identity as an American, as a German, and as a Jew. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the time period when all of that comes into
Comes to a head.
conflict. And on a lesser scale, the fight that occurred within Goldman Sachs also happens within Kuhn Loeb. But Schiff was such a powerful figure in that firm. He basically, his partners were saying, like, we're getting killed out there, we need to make some loans to the Allies. And Schiff basically said, And his objection was really that the money might go to Russia. That's where he put his foot down. If it went just to Britain, he would have been okay with that. But if he just couldn't tolerate any money going to Russia because of their persecution of the Jews. But he basically said, if you want to make this loan, okay, but I'm going to leave the firm. And for his partners, that was just not, he was that. He was that firm.
Some of the members of our audience may not know the history, the earlier history, if we can back up for a moment, of Schiffs' participation in the financing of the Russo-Japanese War. Do you want to talk a little bit about his motivations there and how he got into it, and also sort of delve maybe into the difficulty of telling that history without, of course, feeding sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories?
That's just a fascinating chapter, and that really traces back to these waves of immigration that are swamping New York in the late 1800s. And Schiff, dating back to the 1880s, was increasingly, advocating with presidential administrations to place pressure on the Russian Empire to improve its treatment of the Jews, because they thought what they called the Jewish question at that time, the Jewish question in Russia, could be solved.
Right.
And because the Jews of New York, who were helping to finance all of these aid groups to help the immigrants that were coming in, were just being completely overwhelmed. But all of Schiff's advocacy really, it never really produced much of a result. And meanwhile, there were these flare-ups of mob violence occurring in Russia. And on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War, he's basically, faced with a proposition. The Japanese have been scouring the world for financing. They were seen as the underdog. Russia had a huge war chest, and would Schiff finance the Japanese in this war? And, just to back up to this question of, Jewish banker financing a war, this is how wars were bankrolled back then. JP Morgan obviously played a huge role in making loans during World War I. But they were essentially underwriting these huge bond offerings. By agreeing to finance the Japanese, it just opened up a whole new financial frontier for them, and the ability to raise money and build up their armaments. And at the same time that Schiff
There's also kind of an ironic unwillingness to finance the Japanese on the part of some other bankers because of some racist or racism-informed ideas about who was going to win the war.
Exactly. And, it's what's interesting about this too is that Schiff, on the other side, basically makes it difficult for Russia to raise money in the international money markets. So it's financing Japan while choking off funding to Russia. And so this whole episode, of course, Schiff couldn't have foreseen this at the time, becomes part of this whole myth of the Jewish banker puppeteering world events. This is what people would point to. And, later on, conspiracy theorists would claim that he literally gave the order to kill the Russian Tsar and his family, which is, of course, nonsense.
Right. And provided money to Lenin and Trotsky, right? Like there's this sort of, there's a sort of easy path from the things that he actually did, right?
Exactly.
Which as you talk about in your book, included, for instance, financing anti-Tsarist literature for Russian POWs in Japan, right? But
and
like
they wanted regime change at that time. That is what they that was what they desired. And if you look at the context of what was the historical context of what was playing out, what he'd been advocating for, and the conditions that he was facing, it makes sense why he would have done what he did. But you're right, of course, like, later on this would be pointed to as an episode of the Jewish banker and world control and that sort of stuff.
and Jewish Bolsheviks, right? Like that's the
Jewish.
where it really takes off into an area of complete dementia, right? Like it's the idea that Jacob Schiff would have been comfortable with the Bolshevik Revolution um, is pretty preposterous. Am I right?
Absolutely. And of course he wasn't, he went from, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, he was jubilant. But as he begins to see what transpires after that, his letters show that he was extremely uncomfortable with what was playing out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's to your credit and the credit of the book that you work to shrug off this danger of providing ammunition to anti-Semites and just try to tell the truth about what they did and who they were and how they operated. Um, and but I do wonder, in terms of the way that you focus this really, I think, sensitively and thoughtfully on their lives, their activities, uh, so that I think, as one review of the book pointed out, this is a book really about Jews who are bankers rather than bankers who are Jews. Do you think that's fair?
I thought that was an interest. I know which review you're talking about. I thought that was an
Mm-hmm.
interesting observation because these guys had no choice. They couldn't
They had no
not be
choice but to
Jews.
become fabulously wealthy
No, no,
investment
no, no. I
bankers.
mean, they had no choice they had no choice. They could never be bankers on their own terms without being
Right,
Jews, without being Jewish bankers.
right, right,
Um,
right, right, right.
that's the way that's so I think that's interesting. But
I think it was more, at least the way that I took that line, or that I wondered about that line, and this leads me to my question was about the kind of structural role of finance in American life, and the you paint a portrait of these men that I think is broadly and understandably sympathetic, um, uh, and is quite rightly sensitive to the possibility of reproducing anti-Semitism. But I do wonder if there's, and I hate when book reviewers um, uh, carp and say like, "Oh, this book isn't the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to read." Right? Like he didn't write the book about Schiff and Warburg and Loeb that I wanted to read. Um,
right.
but I'm going to ask a question that's geared that way anyway, just for the
Yeah,
sake of
yeah.
argument.
Yeah.
So can you imagine a book that, without a scintilla of anti-Semitism, really rips these guys apart for the kinds of things that they were taking part of as sort of pivotal actors in Gilded Age capitalism? Um, Not because they were Jews, not because they were bankers necessarily, but because they worked to, among other things, expand the railroads in a transcontinental project of empire building on the part of the U.S. that involved ethnic cleansing, that involved the sort of brutal exploitation of immigrant working classes, many of whom did not have the benefit of the kind of provisional whiteness that the Lehmans were building in the South. Um,
Absolutely. I think that's right. And I mean, even I write about this stuff in the book too, but like the monopolies, they were involved in just building these
mhm,
enormous monopolies, and unwittingly, things got so out of control that Schiff and JP Morgan basically end up creating the modern antitrust regime because they had amassed
mhm,
so much unaccountable power. I mean, one thing that I tried to do in the book was point out, I read about these early episodes in finance with Jacob Schiff, and one of the first thing he does when he comes to the United States when he's 18 years old, um, and very quickly plunges into railroad finance. And the first major venture he's part of is part of one of these like railroad sort of, it was basically a fraud.
like a stock watering scheme.
Yes, and Schiff basically left the country after that. There were other
Hmm.
reasons, but his first firm was a failure, and it unraveled because of that. The Seligmans family had a close relationship with Jay Gould, and they write about how they, you know, when Jay Gould cornered the market for gold in 1869 and caused a major financial,
Hmm.
you know, Joseph Seligman was basically like he was definitely buying golds, in a shady way. And I
Hmm.
try to try to point these things out, but that's the thing, these guys were not angels. And I think, with any like, and this traces back to the Koch book too. I think you just have to paint people as, no one's pure good and nobody's that I've encountered is pure evil, and that you have to just portray them as human.
Full
Um,
and complex human beings.
right. But I do think that if you really, depending on which angle you were to take on this, and if you were to look just at turn of the century finance, and of course it wouldn't just be them who were involved in this rapacious capitalism, but
Not remotely.
not remotely. Yeah. Um, and I do feel as if in many cases, Schiff and and some of the others really took the high road in some cases where
Hmm.
there was much more rampant um and destructive speculation going on. But just in terms of the railroads, the Seligmans they were hired people to, have shootouts with like rival
Yeah, the
railroad.
railroad wars.
Yeah. So all of that stuff was absolutely happening. They were far from perfect, that's for sure.
Right, and they kind of moved in a world that accepted the kind of moral trade-offs that kind of finance required. Right, I was struck actually by the fact that Morty Schiff goes to do his internship with James J. Hill just a couple years after the Pullman strike and the crushing of the American Railway Union. Like that's the world that they're moving in.
Ab-
But on the other hand, I mean, sorry, you can address that if you want.
No, I think I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And
Right. The thing I
later,
was going to move on, the thing I was going to move on to was just that philanthropically speaking, of course, is the other side of their personalities, and of course the trade-off, right? Like the moral trade-off. We're going to take the money we're going to take these ill-gotten gains or like questionably gotten gains and devote it to uh, philanthropy. There were a lot of philanthropists of that era um, who sort of slapped their names on buildings and bought recognition and kind of absolution for whatever they were engaged in. One thinks of Carnegie and the Carnegie Libraries, for instance, as a great example of that. Um, uh, the Frick Museum here in New York, which is having its reopening soon, and everybody should go. It's an amazing collection. Um, but uh, but one of the things that struck me when I was researching Jacob Schiff for my own book was the level of dedication that he showed to kind of personal involvement in local charities here in New York and local philanthropy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, I mean, one thing about Schiff was that he viewed his giving through the sort of Jewish concept of tzedakah, which is sort of, it was not an option, it was an obligation.
Hmm.
And he also did not, he also didn't like the word charity. He did not like the notion. He didn't like to give out money without
Right.
like to have he was, I mean, this is the thing about Schiff. He was an absolute control freak, and this extended to all parts of his life, including in his will, where
A
he's
real authoritarian.
right. He's sort of, placing all these conditions on how this money, basically an aid organization had to change its bylaws in order to accept his bequest. Um,
Right.
you know, uh, but he liked to play a very active role with his philanthropy. He was one of the founders of the Montefiore Hospital and would be there on Sundays, literally reviewing the cases of the patients who would be admitted there. Um,
Hmm.
he just thought that this was part of philanthropic leadership. And what was interesting, Kuhn Loeb's offices were sort of equated to, the White House or something like that. Every Jewish leaders would be tramping in there day after day, to
Mhm.
their proposals and their ideas to, Schiff, who was really the leader of American Jewry at the turn of the century. No major decision got made without his sort of input.
But an unelected leader, right? Like this is part of the tension here is between Schiff's commitment and I think very sincere commitment to kind of vision of non-sectarian democracy in the United States, and his personal kind of high-handedness and micromanagement of almost every aspect of his life and the lives of people who were closest to him. And also some people whose lives were not, in fact, that close to him, like the patients that he was admitting or not admitting to Montefiore Hospital. And this reflects a tension, I think, that I wanted to ask about as well. There's a line of historical analysis, or I wanted to ask if you could address. There's a line of historical analysis that identifies the subjects of your book, not just as combatants or victims of anti-Semitism, but actually as purveyors of anti-Semitism and reproducers of anti-Semitism, not because what they did was sort of misconstrued or mischaracterized by conspiracy theorists, but actually because of some of their philanthropic efforts, particularly around immigration relating to East European Jews, actually reproduced tropes and caricatures of anti-Semitism, and were sort of what you would the sort of contemporary comparator would be something like concessions to quasi-fascist immigration policies from the Democrats, right? It's like not actually helping; it's hurting.
Yeah, they took a very paternalistic posture towards the Eastern European and Russian immigrants. There was and one very interesting example of this was when New York's police commissioner in the early 1900s writes a journal article that says that 50% of criminality in New York is attributable to Jews. And it's not true, but this sets off a crisis. And the reaction of Schiff and his allies and his German Jewish allies is extremely telling, because what they do is they hire a detective to penetrate the underworld of the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side and basically like clean the place out.
Is the Bingham is the Bingham accusation that half of the criminality in New York is attributable to Jews? Is that the police commissioner Bingham? I forget. Is that actually the motivation for the creation of the Kehillah?
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
So like they don't just hire a detective; they create an entire organization.
They create with multiple bureaus to handle education, all sorts of, hygiene, all sorts of,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one example. And then of course there's the Galveston movement where one of Schiff's signature initiatives was to basically, the concern was that so many Jews were coming to New York, and once they got
Mm-hmm.
there, they wanted to stay. So, Schiff was like, well, what if we ship them directly to Texas, and they don't never set foot in New York. Um, so, so I certainly see your point about how, in their
I mean, it's not necessarily my point. It's just a question of kind of there is this line of analysis that identifies, and I think some of the material in your book speaks to this as well. Like I think James Warburg you describe as someone who didn't want to associate with Jewishness at all. The kind of motive, the mode of assimilation first, right?
right. Bobby Lehman was very, in some interviews that I found with his colleagues, they sort of, referred to him as a Jewish anti-Semite.
Right.
So I think there was really quite a bit of that going on because of the social ostracism.
And I wonder how much of that is also about just kind of class and um, assumptions of kind of national origin, right? Like the way that uh, uh, sort of racist tropes of primitive people, uncivilized people are transferable between kind of anti-Semitism and imperialist racism toward any other group. any other group of non-white people.
Yeah, and I think you start to see that more and more in the early 1900s on the path to the, immigration restrictions of 1921 and
Yes.
1924, where, we impose a quota system that really goes back to the, 1880s in order to prevent Jews and other undesirable classes from coming to the United States in any major number.
And so a big advocate of those policies, obviously, was someone that you have an entire chapter about, Henry Ford. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that choice, and about how you came to it. Did you realize when you began the project that you were going to sort of devote that much space, or accord that much kind of causal significance to Ford's anti-Semitism?
I think I understood. I knew that Ford was deeply anti-Semitic, and I planned to delve into that. What I didn't really understand from the outset was the absolutely pivotal role that he would end up playing in unleashing modern anti-Semitism, which I differentiate, of course, from the ancient variety. The modern version is built upon the themes of the protocols of the elders of Zion, which was first published in Russia in around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, but doesn't end up circulating widely outside of Russia until around World War I, when Russian supporters of the Tsar sort of imported to New York and to the United States. Um, you know, Henry Ford, through his Henry Ford, was a staunch pacifist, but he also believed that bankers, and by bankers he meant Jewish bankers, were at the root of World War I. And so that's what sets him off on this crusade. He buys a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and for 7 years and 92 issues, it attacks Jews for everything you could possibly imagine, from financial panics and wars to risque fashion trends such as short skirts and jazz music, which he thought was degenerating um, the American culture. Um, but there was an active feedback loop in that era between, what Ford was doing in the United States and Nazi Germany. When a New York Times reporter visited Ford to interview Hitler to interview him in the early 1920s, there's a portrait of Ford on the wall of this office, on the wall of his office, and in the room outside, it's covered with translated copies of The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem, which was a compendium of Dearborn Independent articles that the Nazis were blanketing Germany with at the time. The frequent targets of these articles, of course, Schiff and his partners in Kuhn Loeb, which are sort of in the view of Ford, the archetype of the international Jew. You have folks like Otto Kahn, who might be familiar to some people, partner in Kuhn Loeb, potentially possibly part of the inspiration for the Monopoly Man. He had held German and British and American citizenship. So, they
My
used
son has all those citizenships too. So,
and but they held up Kahn and Schiff and the binational Warburg brothers, who were German, who owned a German bank in Hamburg, and then there was the American branch of the family as the sort of archetype of the international Jew. And I just think that Henry Ford ended up doing sort of incalculable damage through this newspaper and his other activities during that era.
Yeah, and I think it's also, his production of the Dearborn Independent and all of that coincided, of course, with the influence of American Jim Crow laws and race law on Nazi legal theory, which, for those of you who haven't seen this book, Hitler's American Model by James Q. Whitman talks about this at some length, the sort of influence of not just Ford's anti-Semitism, but Ford, the sort of, the American system more broadly and its embrace of white supremacy. But listen, it's hard to have a conversation about conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and white supremacy and rich people taking control of things without having some sort of discussion of what's going on in our current moment. So do you see echoes of the history that you write about in the current moment?
You mean the world's richest man falling in with the far right and becoming buying a media platform and becoming a major disseminator of conspiracy theories? No. No, yeah. I mean, I think there's certainly in Elon Musk, he's following the Ford playbook. But in terms of just, there are so many modern echoes, whether it's the debate over immigration or income inequality or corporate monopolies, over Israel, over Zionism, over some people think that we're living in another version of the Gilded Age. So there's just a huge amount of parallels between that era and this one, and of course we've seen sort of a resurgence of anti-Semitism as well, which is what Schiff and his contemporaries were facing in the early 1900s. Obviously, this is a bit different, but you can see the parallels.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder if, and maybe, we can get back to the question of Zionism through that and Schiff's relationship to Zionism. I do wonder what you think. I mean, this is a purely speculative question, and it's unfair in that regard. It's not actually about what's in your book so much, but just jumping off of it. But what do you think Schiff would think about the resurgence of anti-Semitism, such as it has emerged, particularly over the last couple of years, in terms of his fears about Zionism? And because I think even when he started, I think you're right that even when he started becoming more open to Zionism after the Balfour Declaration, that he still firmly believed that it was a bad idea to have a Jewish national state.
Yeah, he was able to sort of see, and this was an evolution. I mean, he was able to eventually say, well, we should have a cultural homeland in what was then Palestine. But I think he was worried about, and others of that generation were worried about exactly what sort of has played out to some degree. Now, I mean, the conversation about Zionism sort of drastically changes in a couple decades. There's the Balfour Declaration. Shortly after that, the reason that the Jews of the United States believed that America was their Zion. They thought that the United States was going to be the Jewish refuge. In the 1920s, it quickly becomes clear that that's no longer going to be possible. And then you have, World War II, which changes the conversation about Zionism drastically once again. So, I think it's a good question, like what he would think about that. But I think a lot of his concerns would have been borne out, but whether there was another route is
right
clear.
No, this is the problem with counterfactuals. So I do want to ask one more question, but I think we're getting around to that time where we want to shift to taking some questions from the audience. So I just want to cue that up for Peter so that he can take over the management of questions. But as a final sort of valedictory question here, constraints of word count and requirements of narrative inevitably make it impossible to include everything that we want to include in our books. So are there any sort of delightful nuggets that got left on the cutting room floor that you want to share with our audience?
Gosh, that's a really good question.
Or maybe people that you wish you could have spent more time with in the book.
Um, I wrote a bit about Paul Warburg's son, James, who is sort of interesting, both an interesting financial and political figure, sort of is an advisor to FDR and breaks with FDR. I'd always thought there might be
That's right. Says some of FDR's early New Deal policies are communistic.
Yeah, exactly. And I always thought that I considered whether there was another book to be done, sort of picking up in the 20s and through World War I. And so I would have been interested to explore his story a bit more. I'm interested in the second and third generation, the sort of the scions and what became of them. Um, but I think in terms of anything juicy, I crammed that all in.
Well, people should go out and buy the book, either in hardcover or in paperback. It is, I can attest, full of juicy bits. And thank you again, Dan, for such a wonderful conversation. And Peter, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I want to join David in congratulating you, Dan, on this book. It's really, I mean, the scale of it and the approachability, it's really fantastic. I join Beverly Gage in the praise and everyone else that we've mentioned tonight. I want to remind everyone we have a half an hour of time, so if you have questions, please send those in now. I'm going to sort of jump the queue a bit and just follow up because I think I maybe missed it, but I'm curious what what was the reaction of some of the folks in your story to the events of the 20s and the 30s? Those folks are entering retirement, and how do they make sense of the world that I mean, Schiff passes on and sort of mercifully, but how do they make sense of the world that unfolds after their best efforts to sort of prevent what we all know happens?
Well, I mean, just if in terms of just, the financial worlds, if you look at that, I mean, Paul Warburg, there's a little bit of this in the book, but Paul Warburg, Schiff's brother-in-law, his partner, he is one of the originators of the Federal Reserve System. And in the 1920s, he's getting just more and more concerned about just the runaway train nature of Wall Street. And he sort of, really predicts uh the crash. So I think, you have some of the elder statesmen of Wall Street getting kind of worried about what's going on there. Um, Felix Warburg, who was Paul's brother and was sort of more so than Schiff's own son, was sort of his philanthropic heir, ends up um, spending a lot of money on building up Palestine and working on issues there, especially after the immigration restrictions come into place. So, certainly they're very concerned about those issues.
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's a good deal in the book about, as you mentioned before, about navigating the sort of multiple identities of being Jews and being German and being American. What specifically are they sort of thinking about in terms of the events that are going on overseas in Germany?
In Germany, in what's, Henry Goldman is an interesting example of that because he'd been so vocally pro-German during World War One, loves to go back and visit. And he goes there in the early 1930s, and it's just a totally inhospitable place. And he says, my God, what's happening here. And of course, there's the German side of the Warburg family who are just in the thick of it. Max Warburg, who ran Warburg, was basically, involved in politics. He was involved in political financial commissions. And in the 1930s, the Nazis are basically seizing control of their business. So it was just it was just a reckoning.
Yeah. Okay, turning over, I will relinquish the share and turn again to the audience. So the first question is from Nancy Heller. Biggest surprise of the research? You spent a tremendous amount. I don't know if we mentioned this, but you note in the book you spent you had a couple of kids grow up in the time that you spent writing this book. What were some of the biggest surprises along the way?
What really hit home for me at a certain point was that, for millions of American Jews, their story just would not be possible absent Schiff and his allies and what they did, and that includes myself. They really made it possible for millions and millions of Jews to make their lives here, and not just that, but to thrive. So that was certainly one thing that really, struck me in the research of this of the research of this book.
And this, I think you said a little bit about this at the outset, but following on from your first book, is it, what do you attribute that kind of silence to?
The silence?
The meaning this sort of the strangeness of that sort of these folks sort of disappearing from that popular, Schiff is a ubiquitous character as you describe him in the, and it's sort of strange that they sort of disappear from popular imagination.
I mean, what's interesting is that I think part of it has to do with just, the firm of Kuhn Loeb itself sort of disappears from Wall Street in the 70s, merges with Lehman. It's sort of the story of financial consolidation. Kuhn Loeb is acquired by American Express, and then it sort of just disappears. But I do think part of it had to do, part of the reason that Schiff, and this is another, to go back, this is another thing that I sort of struck me is that Schiff was every bit as important, if not more so, than J.P. Morgan, if you sort of take in the totality of his legacy, financial, philanthropic, foreign policy. But you wouldn't know that from what is currently out there. And I think part of that is just because he was part of this is because he was Jewish.
Yeah. That's hard to skip that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Louise Bernicow asks, what about the women in the story? Annie Meyer, who founded Bernard College with Schiff's money, was a huge advocate of restricting immigration to Jews, for example. What did you find about the women in this story?
That's a really good question. What was and I write about this a little bit, and so often women are written out of these of the history, but the matriarchs of these families played a very important role as both sort of unofficial business partners, but also in helping to direct some of the philanthropic efforts. Schiff would never have gotten involved in some of the causes that he got involved in if not for his mother-in-law, Betty Loeb, who in fact was the one that introduced him to Lillian Wald of the Henry Street settlement. There are some funny stories in the piece too about, the matriarch of Warburg, who was the sort of hidden power behind that firm. And when her sons would sort of come home from the stock exchange would demand to see their business ledger and then, sort of upbraid them for making stupid trades. So they certainly played a major role in this story.
Betty Loeb, I feel like, serves as a huge inspiration to Jacob Schiff more broadly and to others in the family. I mean, from the kinds of quotes that you employ about Betty Loeb in the book.
Absolutely. I think she was sort of, she was sort of a philanthropic guiding force in their family.
And also this bon vivant, right? Like this incredible larger
bon
than life
vivant,
figure who, yeah.
loves music and art and yeah, absolutely.
I love the anecdote about her basically she, she considers not going to the table at Yom Kippur fasting. So she has her food brought to her, and that's fasting.
Exactly. Exactly.
But does that not count? Well, surprisingly, we I think are sort of at the close here. Oh, I'm sorry, no. One question just came in. Francis, who asks, okay, some of the most accomplished jazz musicians, composers of the series of the period are Jewish men. Does that influence Ford's disdain of jazz?
I think that was certainly part of it.
I would, yeah, any grist for the mill, I would assume, right?
And it was also sort of the fact that Jewish financiers were backing some jazz labels and also motion pictures that Ford certainly, he was seen as this great modernizer, but the contradiction was that he yearned for the traditions of the past. So, basically saw Jewish influence in all of the the new modern trends that he felt were harming American culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was part of a sort of larger story of the intersections between specifically anti-Semitism and other forms of white supremacy in the United States, because of course jazz was also a disproportionately African American art form.
Dan, we are we're a little bit shy of our usual end time, but I'm going to call things early tonight and say just once again, congratulations on this book. It was a delight to have you here at the Gotham Center. I hope everyone that watches this event tonight and a recording, which will be on YouTube tomorrow on our channel, goes out and buys your book. It is absolutely worth the read. Incredibly enjoyable to read just on a literary level, but also I learned a tremendous amount. So delighted to have you. Looking forward, is there actually going to be a third volume, sort of second volume to this book in terms of the reference you made a second ago to the sort of second and third generations? Can we say anything about that research? Is that underway?
I mean, I'm interested in doing that. It's at a certain point. As you may have gleaned, I'm quite interested in Henry Ford at the moment. So I think my next book is going to be about Ford and sort of the prelude to American fascism.
Yeah. Don't blame you. And timely, unfortunately. Is it true actually that Hitler had a poster of Ford?
He had a picture. He had a picture of a portrait of Ford on the wall of his office.
Yeah.
He personally awarded Ford a Nazi honor, right?
In 1938, I think. Yes.
Well, on that happy note, thinking about nothing contemporary at all. I will say good evening to everyone that came, and thank you again to David for, as expected, wonderfully thoughtful, rich questions, and Dan, as expected, wonderfully thoughtful, rich answers. So I congratulate you on the book and thank everyone for joining us tonight. The event will be on YouTube tomorrow, and I hope that it leads to a huge rush of sales.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.